would you do if you walked into a store bearing your own name and saw an employee behind the counter wiping away tears? Richard Hale, the founder of the Hale's Burgers chain, had only planned to take his son out for lunch like always. But the moment he stepped into the small roadside location, something felt wrong. No one smiled. Employees moved like they were being watched. And the cashier, Lisa, though still taking orders, couldn't hide the fatigue and confusion in her eyes. As Richard placed his order, he heard a soft sob from behind the door, behind the counter. And in that moment, he knew this wasn't just a meal. It was a silent cry for help from the very place he once promised to build with kindness. Richard Hale was never the kind of boss who sat comfortably above it all. He built Hale's Burgers from nothing, starting with a beat-up food truck in a high school parking lot. Nearly 4 decades later, the company had grown to over 300 locations across the U.S. While operations had long been handed off to the system, he still kept one old habit. Now and then, he'd drop into a random store as just a regular customer, unannounced, no business card, no assistant in tow. That day was a clear sky afternoon. Richard had driven his youngest son, Nathan, 12 years old, out for lunch. The boy loved Hale's fried chicken and fries more than any other restaurant. It was also a rare chance for father and son, time not easily found between all the meetings, emails, and constant scheduling. Today's stop was a branch by the highway, on the edge of a small town. The glass doors sparkled. The iconic red signage stood bright and proud. Everything outside looked clean and tidy, but Richard sensed something was off the second he walked in. Inside, it was too quiet for midday. No cheerful greetings, no smiles from the counter. The staff behind the line were busy, but not in the usual upbeat way. More like flustered and scattered. A young employee clumsily wiped the counter, dropping a metal tray and muttering a nervous apology. The line cook kept his head down, back slightly hunched, flipping patties as if he were racing against time. Richard stepped to the counter. The cashier was a young woman in her mid-20s. She looked exhausted, dark circles showing despite a dusting of powder. Her name tag read Lisa. She forced a smile as Richard and his son approached, but it never reached her eyes. "Hi there, 2 number 3s, right?" she asked, glancing at Nathan's jacket with the Hale's Burgers logo. "Boss," Richard smiled. "1 number 3 and a vanilla shake for the little guy here." Lisa nodded, tapped a few keys, then turned toward the kitchen. Her movements lacked the confidence you'd expect from a longtime employee. Richard noticed she walked with a slight limp, as if from an old knee injury. He sat at a table near the window with Nathan. The boy was glued to a game on his phone, while Richard watched the room, not out of curiosity, but with the seasoned eye of someone who'd spent a lifetime in the service industry. His gaze moved from the napkin dispenser to the way employees turned when pouring drinks, to the body language between the manager and the team. Something felt off. The space was physically open, yet the staff all seemed withdrawn. A tall man in a white buttoned-up shirt emerged from the back office. The moment he stepped out, his eyes swept the room like a laser. Employees stiffened, movement speeding up. Lisa dropped a receipt, and instead of handing it to her, the man, whose name tag read Mark, picked it up and set it silently on the counter, his face expressionless. Richard watched him for a long moment. There was something about this man that unsettled him, not just because he didn't smile, but because no one else around him dared to. Lisa continued working, but her hands trembled slightly each time she accepted money from a customer. A woman at the front frowned about undersalted fries, but no one apologized. Not from lack of training, but because, apparently, apologies weren't allowed here. "Dad, why aren't they happy?" Nathan asked softly, just loud enough for Richard to hear. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he scanned the room again, then looked at his son and offered a gentle smile. "They're trying," he said, "but something might be wrong here. And if that's true, we should find out what it is." Nathan nodded. He was used to how his father approached things. Never rushed, never judging, but always noticing what others overlooked. And Richard, his mind was already piecing it together. Lisa's forced smile, Mark's cold eyes, the uneasy silence between shifts, and the alien feeling inside a place that bore his name, but was meant to be a casual lunch, had now turned into something else entirely, a real inspection, and he knew, beneath the polished surface of a hot burger, something deeper was brewing. "Sit here for a bit," Richard said, giving Nathan a light pat on the shoulder. "I'm going to wash my hands." The boy nodded, barely registering it. His eyes were locked on the game on his phone. Richard walked toward the hallway at the back that led to the staff area. The door to the break room was slightly ajar, just enough for a conversation inside to leak out. He had only meant to check who was managing the shift today, but the voices stopped him cold. A man's voice, low, harsh. "You think this is a playground, Lisa? That's twice you've been late this week." A woman's voice, quiet, trying to stay calm. "I'm sorry, my mom was hospitalized. I messaged the supervisor in advance." Message. "I'm the one who makes decisions here, not that damn internal app." A thud, something hitting the table. "You want to keep this job or not? Stop making excuses." Silence. Then Lisa's voice again, even softer. "I need this job, Mark." "Then act like it. I don't know anyone, pity. Here it's about hours and results. Don't like it? The door's right there." Richard stood frozen. Each word hit like a punch, not a reprimand, but something darker. This wasn't an isolated outburst. It was a style, a way of managing built on fear, pressure, and abuse of power. He stepped back, quietly, then looped around and returned to the front of the restaurant. "You were gone a while, Dad," Nathan said, glancing up. "Restroom was busy," Richard replied briskly, though his thoughts had already shifted. As someone who had done everything from scrubbing pans to managing logistics, Richard knew one thing. If the cashier, the face of the store, can't smile, something inside the system is broken. He scanned the room again. Lisa was now hunched over the order screen, avoiding eye contact. Mark stood behind her, arms crossed, watching the staff like a prison warden. No one said anything, but the tension filled the space. It showed in the clicks of the cash register, in the stiff way employees walked, in the mechanical rhythm of their movements. When a worker fears their manager, they become rigid, less responsive. But when an entire team fears one person, the store becomes a sealed box. No creativity, no initiative, just exhaustion. Richard didn't need to dig deep to realize this wasn't just a bad lunch shift. It was the result of broken management, long-standing, and entrenched enough to choke the spirit of the entire team. He turned to Nathan. "You see Lisa?" The boy nodded. "Do you think she's happy working here?" Nathan hesitated, then shook his head. "She looked like she's scared of someone." Richard gave a small nod. The boy had noticed something that many adults either missed or chose to ignore. Later, as the two of them got ready to leave, Richard stepped up to the counter. Lisa was handing back change to a customer. He waited until she looked up and met his gaze. He didn't say much, just offered a calm smile. Not the smile of a customer, but of someone who understood. Lisa looked briefly confused, then gave a small nod and quickly glanced away. Mark stood behind her, still arms crossed, now eyeing Richard with suspicion. Maybe he didn't recognize who was in front of him. Or worse, he didn't care. And that was the most dangerous kind of person. Someone entrusted with power who didn't see it as a responsibility. As Richard drove home, Nathan dozed off in the passenger seat, worn out from the long afternoon. Richard didn't feel angry. He felt a deep sadness. The values he had built the company on, respect, transparency, decency, were being warped somewhere within the system he had created. Hale's Burgers wasn't meant to be a place people endured just to earn a paycheck. It was supposed to be a place where they could work with dignity. And if one store had gone off course, it couldn't be fixed with a warning call. It had to start from the root, from the way people were managed, from the people themselves, from rebuilding trust. Richard knew he'd return to that store, but next time, he wouldn't come just as a secret customer. A few days later, Richard came back to that Hale's Burgers location. This time, Nathan wasn't with him. No suit, no assistant. Just a 60-year-old man in a heavy coat holding a paper coffee cup, sitting in a quiet corner near the emergency exit. He didn't need to introduce himself, didn't need anyone to recognize him. He just sat there, watching. From that corner, he could see the full counter, the prep area, and the hallway to the break room. The morning dragged on slowly. Staff worked in silence, not the kind of focused silence, but the kind that weighs heavy. People looked at the clock more than at the customers. The place had no spark. Richard noticed Mark had been there since early morning, pacing constantly behind the counter, not doing much, just watching, pointing, occasionally stepping into employees' tasks. He didn't say much, but his gaze alone was enough to make people uneasy. Close to noon, Mark stepped up behind Lisa while she was ringing up an elderly customer. He whispered something into her ear. She froze momentarily, visibly shaken, but forced a smile and continued serving like nothing happened. Mark circled behind her and opened the cash drawer. No keystrokes, no order needed change. He simply reached in, pulled out a few bills, crumpled them into his palm, and slipped them into his coat pocket. Richard frowned. Every move was calculated, and this wasn't his first time. The ease of it all, the familiarity, meant it had happened before, many times. Later that noon, Richard slipped into the back kitchen area, where the air was thick with oil and grilled meat. Standing near the hand-washing sink, pretending to inspect a receipt, he caught sight of Alex, a cook Richard recognized from previous system audits. "Alex, right?" Richard said casually. The cook jumped slightly, then looked up, studying him. He didn't fully recognize the man, but he knew he wasn't just another customer. "Yes, you came by during this location's opening, didn't you?" Richard nodded, neither confirming nor denying. "How's it going? The vibe feels off." Alex glanced around. No one nearby. He lowered his voice. "Honestly, we don't talk about it out loud, but we all feel it. Ever since Mark became manager, everything's changed." "In what way?" Alex hesitated. "He does surprise checks, scolds people in front of customers. New hires quit after just a week. If you push back, he cuts your hours or dumps you on the worst shifts. And in the break room, he installed a fake camera, but tells us it's always watching. Everyone's scared." Richard nodded slowly. He had heard plenty of stories about bad management, but when it came straight from someone living through it, it carried a different weight. At the end of the shift, Richard waited by the back exit. When Lisa came out, he approached gently, making sure not to startle her. "Lisa, I'm Richard Hale," he said directly, "founder of Hale's Burgers. I'm not here to blame anyone. I'm here to understand what's really happening." Lisa froze for a second, then she glanced around, as if still unsure whether to believe him. You're really Richard Hale? I just saw Mark take cash from the drawer with no transaction, and I have a feeling that's just the tip of the iceberg. Can you tell me the rest?" Lisa gripped her bag strap tightly, her eyes uncertain, then gave a small nod. "He edits the timesheets. He cuts hours, deletes overtime, reclassifies them as regular hours to avoid paying extra. I lost nearly 12 hours of overtime last month." Richard tilted his head. "Is anyone else affected?" "Pretty much everyone has been at some point, but no one dares speak up. Mark threatens anyone who complains, says they'll be transferred far away, or worse, fired, for cause." Jane, the new kitchen assistant, was forced out just for asking about missing shift pay. HR never even saw her. Mark submitted her resignation for her. Richard didn't need to hear more. Mark was manipulating a small system within the larger system, a branch ruled by fear, exploiting every hour and every paycheck. And the worst part, it had gone on long enough to feel normal to the people working there. He looked at Lisa and said softly, "Thank you. I'll take care of this." Lisa gave a faint nod, not out of full trust, but with a fragile glimmer of hope. Sometimes that's all it takes to begin change. A few days later, Richard returned to the corporate office. His 17th floor corner room overlooked the whole city, but today he couldn't care less about the view. The window stayed open, but his eyes were fixed on his computer screen. He called the internal accounting team. No need to make noise, just a quiet request. Compare the financial records of the Garden Hill location to this time last year and to similar-sized branches. Within the hour, the report landed in his inbox. Richard read every line himself, No summary needed. From the very first page, Richard knew something was wrong. Garden Hill's net revenue over the past 3 months had dropped nearly 18% compared to similar-sized branches, even though the number of daily receipts remained steady, even slightly increasing. Ingredient orders, meat, buns, potatoes, cheese, hadn't gone down either, meaning customers were still coming, products were being sold, but the money wasn't showing up. Richard frowned. He scrolled down to the operating expenses section. One line item kept repeating, operational adjustments, vague and unspecific. In most other branches, this category either read zero or a few $100s in small expenses. But at Garden Hill, the amount ranged from $3,000, 0 cents, per month. He leaned back in his chair, a long-held habit. When something didn't add up, he didn't speak right away. He thought. Operational adjustments? It could mean fixing the AC, replacing lights, or minor staff costs. But no one funnels thousands of dollars through an undefined label without clarification, unless they mean to. Richard called accounting again. Send me the detailed invoices listed under operational adjustments for Garden Hill over the past 6 months. 2 hours later, the folder was in his hands. Some invoices were clearly legitimate: a new water heater, LED signage repairs, a new ice machine. But others, on closer inspection, didn't match the professional look of their usual vendors. Some stamps were smudged, some signatures looked copy-pasted, and strangest of all, every single one was issued by a vendor called A&M Solutions, a name that had never appeared in the Hales Burger system before. Richard searched the name in the company's internal database. No results. He tried Google. Nothing definitive except a virtual mailbox address in an industrial park. No office, no website, no business phone, a shell company. And if A&M was fake, then the person authorizing the payments to it was the one behind it all. Dawson. His name appeared on the bottom line of every expense approval page. Same ink, same rushed, careless stroke, like a man far too used to signing things without thought. Richard exhaled, then leaned forward, fingers steepled, until the panel exploded. Everything he'd suspected from the start was beginning to take shape. This wasn't just intimidation-style management. It wasn't just pocketing bills from the till. It was a small-scale but calculated scheme, disguised in vagueness and neglect. No one noticed because the dollar amounts weren't large enough to trigger alarms at the corporate level, but stretched over 6-9 months, and if replicated at multiple locations, it was a crack in the foundation. He opened his laptop and drafted an email to the independent audit team requesting a full review of the Garden Hill location, with specific attention to operational adjustments, timekeeping records, and sales logs. He instructed them to proceed quietly. No advance warning. When he hit send, Richard sat in silence. The truth was emerging. This wasn't about punishing one man. It was about how the system had allowed small signs to slip by, masked by smooth operations. Hales Burgers had been built on fairness and transparency, but somewhere in its machinery, shadows had taken root, waiting for complacency to flourish. Richard knew, once the truth starts surfacing, you go all the way, not just to set an example, but to recover what the brand almost lost: trust. He didn't rush. Cases like this collapse under haste. He knew when one door to fraud is opened, there's often a hallway behind it. He called David Langley, Hale's CFO and someone Richard trusted above anyone else in the company. David was a former auditor from a major international firm, strict, principled, and incorruptible. Richard got straight to the point. David, I want you to check every location Mark Dawson has ever managed. Go back 3 years. I suspect Garden Hill is just the tip of the iceberg. David didn't ask why. He knew his boss didn't chase hunches without reason. I'll need 2 days, he replied. 2 days later, Richard received a report more than 30 pages long. The first section was crystal clear. Of the 6 locations Mark had managed in the past 3 years, 4 had documented unusual operational adjustments. Same pattern: vague expenses, off-the-books totals, unclear vendors, all signed off directly by Mark. Richard read slowly, line by line. Even though he'd braced himself, it still stung to see how systematic the fraud had become. This wasn't someone pocketing a few $100s. This was a machine, a repeatable scheme, deployed across locations, under different names, but always guided by the same hand. But what truly caught him off guard came at the end of the report. David had checked internal promotion records and personnel evaluations, and at every stage of Mark's advancement, manager, store manager, then transferred to reform underperforming branches, and finally nominated for regional supervisor, one name consistently appeared under recommending officer, Ronald Vickers. Regional director, Richard frowned. He'd met Ronald a few times in meetings. Tall, well-dressed, smooth talker, the textbook corporate leader, always delivering concise updates, saying just enough to avoid scrutiny. Over the years, Richard had no reason to doubt him. The branches under Ronald's supervision submitted solid numbers. No major scandals, nothing alarming, but now everything looked different. Picked up the phone and called David. "Are you sure Ronald signed off on every promotion involving Mark?" "Positive," David replied. "And in some cases, Ronald personally intervened to keep Mark in place when complaints were raised by staff." "Yes, 2 internal reports from last year, one from the West Side branch, the other from Fremont. Both mentioned mistreatment of staff and inconsistencies in bookkeeping." Ronald dismissed both, citing lack of concrete evidence. Richard went silent. The pieces were locking together, one by one. This wasn't about a rogue manager anymore. This was protection, a hidden power structure, shielding itself, using the distance between corporate headquarters and the storefronts as cover from oversight. And that made Richard angry, not because he'd been fooled, but because he, the founder who built Hale's Burgers from scratch, had believed his model was transparent enough, personal enough, that something like this wouldn't happen. He thought a good system would self-correct. But now he saw, no system can stand against silence, especially when the ones at the top choose to look away. He knew he had to confront Ronald, but not with emotion. He needed evidence, he needed data, and he needed a plan. Richard called David again. "Next step," he said, "go through every email, internal message, and document exchanged between Ronald and Mark in the last 2 years. If there's anything shady, I want to see it." "I'm on it," David replied. Before hanging up, Richard added, quietly but firmly, "This time, we're not stopping at Mark. I want the whole chain, from the hand in the till to the final signature." On Monday morning, the Garden Hill branch of Hale's Burgers opened like usual, but something felt different. Staff were told the store would temporarily close that morning for an all-hands meeting. No one knew exactly what was going on, but all eyes turned to the salt and pepper head man standing quietly at the front counter, Richard Hale. No suit, no entourage, no security detail. Just a simple rolled-up shirt, leaning against a table, watching each person walk into the small back meeting room normally used for shift breaks or quick team huddles. Mark Dawson arrived a few minutes late, visibly startled to see Richard seated in the center of the room. He quickly masked his surprise with a calm exterior and entered as if nothing were out of place. A few staff lowered their eyes at his entrance, others simply stared. Richard waited until everyone was seated. Then he stood, no mic, no notes, just his voice, steady and firm. "I'm Richard Hale. Some of you may have never met me, but my name is on the logo you wear on your uniforms and above every storefront where you've come to work." The room was silent, tense. "Today I'm not here as the CEO. I'm here as a father who brought his son to this very location for lunch." I sat down, looked around, and knew something was wrong. He looked directly at Mark. I started asking questions, quietly, carefully, and what I found wasn't just a troubled manager, but a small system built on fear, abuse of power, and fraud. Mark furrowed his brow, about to speak, but Richard raised a hand to signal silence. "I have evidence, and the legal department will take it from here. But I want to say this clearly, in front of everyone. Mark Dawson, you are hereby suspended, effective immediately, and will be investigated in full for misconduct, wage theft, falsifying timesheets, and embezzling revenue. The room froze. Mark let out a bitter laugh, trying to maintain composure. I don't know what you're talking about. This is a misunderstanding. I have the right. Lisa stood up. No, you don't. You don't have the right to threaten staff, cut shifts for personal reasons, alter someone's pay, and then force them into silence. Her voice was clear, stronger than ever. Alex stepped forward from the back, nodding. We've endured enough. Today, thanks to Mr. Hale, someone finally looked at what's really been going on. Other employees began to speak up, without being asked. They had waited too long to tell their stories. One recalled being yelled at by Mark mid-shift. Another spoke about having their hours cut for no reason. Someone broke down in tears, relieved, finally feeling heard. Mark could no longer maintain his cool, his face flushed red, his eyes darting with a mix of rage and panic. But no one was listening to him anymore. No one feared him now. Richard turned to the staff. I'm sorry this went on for so long. I'm sorry I didn't hear you sooner. But starting today, that changes. He looked at each of them, his expression firm but warm. No one here will be silenced for speaking up. And I want you to know, this company was never built on fear. It was built by honest, hardworking, decent people like all of you. He nodded to Lisa, then Alex, then the rest. I'll be here for a few days to listen, to fix things, and to make sure everyone is treated with respect. Mark was escorted out of the restaurant in silence. No one saw him off. Not a word of farewell. The door closed behind him, and with it, the atmosphere in the room seemed to shift, lighter, easier to breathe, as if a long-standing knot had finally been untied. 1 week after the meeting at the Garden Hill location, Richard Hale walked into the 12th floor boardroom of headquarters, a room he'd sat in hundreds of times during his 30-year journey building Hale's Burgers. But this time wasn't about earnings reports or market expansion. This time, he was here to lay out the truth. The room was tense. 12 board members sat around the long table, each wearing a guarded expression. Ronald Vickers, the regional director, was present too, eerily composed. James Prescott, a senior board member with significant influence in the company, sat at the head of the table, hands clasped. Richard stood, he didn't rush, gently flipping open a folder in front of him. He spoke in a steady, resolute voice. I'll get straight to the point. During our internal investigation into misconduct at the Garden Hill location, we discovered that this wasn't the fault of one individual, but part of a coordinated chain of behavior. And unfortunately, that chain includes someone in this room. Ronald's lips tightened. A few board members began flipping through the documents before them. Under my direction, Richard continued, our finance team reviewed every location ever managed by Mr. Mark Dawson. The result, at least 4 other branches over the past 3 years, showed signs of revenue skimming, falsified timesheets, and wage theft, all with the same pattern. Richard turned to CFO David Langley, who nodded and switched the conference screen to a detailed data chart. Each figure was clear. Inventory intake, actual hours worked, net revenue. None of it aligned. The problem is, Richard added, all these reports were signed off and legitimized by one person, Ronald Vickers. The room went dead silent. Ronald frowned but said nothing. Yet, Richard stepped closer to the screen. We also discovered several special expense entries in the regional budget labeled as operational adjustments. But in reality, they were vague payments with no proper documentation, and the person who approved them was Ronald. Richard paused briefly, then he turned directly to James Prescott. But it doesn't stop there. During our internal transaction audit, David and I found a pattern of irregular transfers between Ronald and a company account linked to Mr. James Prescott. James narrowed his eyes slightly. What are you implying, Richard? He asked, voice calm but noticeably colder. I'm not implying anything, Richard said. I'm stating it plainly. There were payments listed as strategic consulting fees to a company where you hold a controlling interest. At the same time, Ronald retained his position and was even promoted despite numerous internal complaints from stores under his supervision. Richard slid a printed list of the transactions across the table to the board members. A few of them started murmuring among themselves. Ronald finally spoke, sharply. "This is speculative. I've never done anything against the rules," James added, trying to keep his composure. "You can't draw conclusions from a few numbers." Richard raised his hand, "Which is why I'm not drawing conclusions. I'm presenting facts. And my recommendation is that both of you be suspended, pending a full investigation. If you are indeed clean, I trust internal review will prove it." Silence followed. Then board member Catherine Moore was the first to speak. "I support the motion for suspension. This is no longer about speculation. This is about the credibility of our entire organization." A second board member nodded, then a third. Ultimately, with a majority vote, the motion to suspend Ronald Vickers and James Prescott was passed. The two left the boardroom without a word. The door closed behind them. This time not just on two individuals, but on a buried chapter of corruption within the system. Richard sat down. Fatigue was clear on his face, but in his eyes was a different light. Relief. He looked around the table, his voice low but steady. "We can't run a company on silence, and we can't grow if we trade trust for numbers. I don't need a perfect company, but I do need a real one." On a Monday morning, the main lobby of Hale's Burgers headquarters was no longer just a venue for welcoming VIP guests or launching new products. This time, it had been arranged like a press room. Behind the podium was a simple banner: Truth, Counter-Accountability, Change. Under the lights, Richard Hale stood, not in a sharp business suit as usual, but in a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, khakis, and no tie. "Thank you all for coming. Today, I'm not here as a CEO, but as a fellow human being, to tell a story we should have shared long ago." Richard didn't speak loudly, but every word was clear. The room was almost completely silent, filled only with the clicks of cameras and the soft tapping of reporters' keyboards. For years, wrongdoings happened within our system. Power was abused, employees were threatened, exploited, and at times, silence was chosen over speaking up. He turned to look at Lisa and Alex, seated in the front row, alongside a few former staff members who had quietly left the company. But today, those who were wronged chose to stand up. Lisa took the podium, her hands slightly trembling, but her voice was firm. She told her story: the long shifts, the altered time cards, the constant fear during evening hours. Then she described that one lunch shift when Richard arrived as just another customer, quietly watching. Alex followed. He spoke of witnessing Mark pocketing cash yet feeling powerless because even if you report it, no one listens. Then he described the moment someone finally asked him, "Is that true?" And it came from Richard himself. Richard returned to the microphone, turning through pages of documents and presenting the facts: manipulated financial records, tampered payrolls, buried internal reports. Nothing was exaggerated, nothing was downplayed. When he finished, he said slowly, "We're not just apologizing, we're taking action." Right after the press conference, that evening's news was filled with headlines. Hale's Burgers goes public about internal violations, commits to full reform. Those who had stayed silent began sending emails, sharing their stories online. Several former employees threatened by Mark spoke out. The public was surprised, but overwhelmingly supportive. 3 days later, the board of directors called an emergency meeting. Richard presented his comprehensive reform plan. "First, we're launching an anonymous reporting system for all employees at every level. Every report will be handled by an independent audit unit, bypassing direct management. Second, a whistleblower protection policy will be issued this week. No one, let me emphasize, no one, will be punished, threatened, or retaliated against for telling the truth. Third, all store leaders, regional managers, and higher-level supervisors will be required to undergo mandatory training in professional ethics, fair leadership, and transparency." The proposals were passed with near-unanimous support. Catherine Moore, the board member who had backed Ronald's suspension, spoke briefly. "Not everyone has the courage to expose their own company's truth. That's exactly why This change matters. In the weeks that followed, Hale's Burgers became more than just a fast food chain. It became a symbol of a system that could admit its wrongs and fix them. Newspapers praised the wise and responsible response from the founder, and labor rights organizations cited Hale's as a positive example. Lisa was invited to advise on the internal training program. Alex was promoted to shift lead at the Garden Hill store, where the workplace atmosphere had completely transformed. Richard remained in his leadership role, but he was seen at the stores more often, not from a distance, but right behind the counter, asking every staffer, "How are things lately? Anything we can do better?" He knew real change doesn't come from a speech, it comes from listening every single day. The next spring, the red and white sign at the Garden Hill Hale's Burgers location was replaced. The logo remained, but a new line appeared underneath, "Honest from the inside." Customers returned not because of a flashy marketing campaign, but for something simpler. They trusted the place. Every customer comment was carefully read. Staff no longer dreaded their shifts. In the backroom meeting area, the tension was gone, replaced by the sound of regular conversation and laughter. Lisa is now an assistant manager, tablet in hand as she walks around checking shift logs, occasionally stopping to chat with new hires. She doesn't carry herself with authority, but everyone listens. Someone once said, "She used to be one of us, so she understands what we need." That was true, and worth more than any title. Alex, who once kept quietly to the back kitchen, now visits branches across the region, supporting operations, staffing, and even morale. He doesn't say much, but the way he looks people in the eye and listens makes them feel something. Respected. Upstairs, the numbers are telling a different story too. First quarter sales were up 14% year over year. But what made Richard Hale proud wasn't the Greenfield report, it was the internal survey. Over 90% of employees rated the environment as positive or very positive. That had never happened before. On a Saturday, Richard drove to Garden Hill with his son, the same boy who joined him for lunch that first day. No one recognized Richard Hale. He picked a corner table like any regular customer, wearing a polo shirt and a baseball cap. Lisa came over, greeted his son by name. No awkwardness. The boy smiled and ordered the same as last time: cheeseburger, fries, vanilla milkshake. Richard looked around and saw Lisa scanning the tables, not to monitor, but to make sure everyone was doing okay. Behind the counter, a young new employee smiled while handing back a customer's change. "Do you notice a difference?" Richard asked as he opened his burger. "Yeah, it feels happier now. I remember last time the cashier didn't smile." Richard didn't reply right away. He looked down at the burger in his hands. It was just like before, but everything had changed. When they finished, he stood up and glanced around one last time. A small sign posted inside read, "We're not just here to serve customers, but to support each other." Not a slogan, a reminder. As they stepped outside, his son asked, "Dad, what do you think makes a company good?" Richard paused for a moment, then smiled. "A good company is a place where, if you worked there, I wouldn't have to worry about you every day." That's what he had learned, not from a management book, but from quiet conversations, overlooked glances, and a lunch that seemed ordinary, but wasn't. Hale's Burgers once stumbled, almost losing its soul, but it was the quiet strength of people like Lisa, Alex, and dozens of other employees that helped it rediscover its essence. And Richard understood more clearly than ever. Profit is an outcome, not the purpose. A business endures not because it sells well, but because it treats people right, from staff to customers. At the end of that day, he wrote a short line in his journal. "We didn't just correct mistakes, we started over the right way." A few months later, Lisa was no longer the timid cashier behind the counter. She became the one training new staff, not just how to make a burger, but how to treat one another with decency during even the most hectic shifts. Hale's Burgers changed from within, not through loud marketing campaigns, but by listening to every quiet voice that had once gone unheard. Laughter returned to the branches. The fearful glances were replaced by encouragement, handshakes, and the simple words, "Thanks for being here today." Richard now saw one truth clearer than ever. A great restaurant doesn't begin with a recipe. It begins with how people treat one another. And if you ever thought you're too small to make a difference, remember, sometimes a single look that says, "I see you," is enough to make someone feel they matter.